Welcome to the new Hoofer Outing Podcast. I'm Julia. I'm the vice president for this upcoming semester.
And I'm Alex. I'm the marketing chair for Outing this coming year. And we've been working on putting together this series to kind of create connection between members when we're unable to be doing normal activities and getting together over the summer, and just to highlight the unique and amazing people and activities that the Outing Club has to offer.
In this episode and future ones alike, we'll have 3 parts. So first is the weekly challenge, which you've seen from me in emails. This past week it was about making tiny boats. The second part is stories from community members and students. And lastly, the tent talk, which can either be in the form of experts or leaders in the club sharing technical tips and tricks, or a cool story or how-to about that activity or the theme of the week. So, speaking of which, this week specifically, the theme is Wild About Water, featuring the awesome paddling community of Hoofer Outing Club.
And also for upcoming episodes, we'd love to hear any suggestions or ideas for tent talks or just our weekly challenges. Any comments, we'd love to hear them. You can email Julia at her email vptrips@hooferouting.org. So yeah, enjoy!
Okay.
Oh! No!
Okay, it's okay.
He's drowning.
Okay, wait. We'll just put the boat in first. Oh, got water in it. It's okay. It's floating. My sail. No. Okay. It's so good. Okay.
That's fine. For science.
Oh boy. Wow. Now we know.
There we go.
Oreos full in boats.
So to kick things off with our stories, we've got a pretty crazy one for you from Ted Bialik, who, if you know anything about Ted, he's an absolute legend on the river. Even if you don't know him personally, you've probably heard about Ted if you've heard anything about paddling. So just a disclaimer, Ted sent us this story that was 6 pages, so we cut it down a little bit. So it's not Ted's original story. We modified it to say he instead of I and cut a few things out. But overall, we think you're going to be really excited about this story.
Okay. Here we go.
All right. I'm not sure that I'd want a drop named after me. It usually means that you've done something pretty stupid. Those were some of Ned Rupert's first words to Ted Bialik when he met him in the year 2000 when he got back to Madison. The year was 1982 or 1983. Ted had begun paddling whitewater kayaks with Hoofers in 1979. In those years, during the months from March through May, he did not know where he'd be on any given weekend, but knew that it would be on a river somewhere depending on what was running.
It was a glorious spring day, probably March or April. All the rivers were running. We were up on the north shore of Minnesota and decided to run the Poplar. Ted had never been on that river, but he'd heard about it, and it was one of the many excellent North Shore rivers. The North Shore of Lake Superior, Minnesota, is probably the most concentrated region of whitewater in the nation. It was once volcanic, followed by glaciers, and after the last one melted some 10,000 years ago, there wasn't a lot of topsoil left. The rock that the glaciers could not scour away is very hard.
So one problem with these rivers is they all contain major waterfalls. This means that it's very easy to get yourself into very serious trouble very quickly, unless you're with a strong group of paddlers who have been on the river before. You need to be cautious and know where to take out in portage. You also need a bomb-proof roll, which is when your boat flips over, as it usually does when you're paddling, and you use your paddle to flip yourself back upright. These are not good rivers to swim in. That is, to miss your roll and swim out of your boat upside down.
Ted was with a strong group. They were all hair boaters, a paddling term of the era, meaning that they'd run stuff so scary that it would make your hair stand on end. Jim Rada was a legend, and Ted knew his name even down in Madison before he got up to the Twin Cities in 1980.
Now, Ted didn't know a lot about the Poplar, apart from what the guys had told him, that there was a mandatory portage. They said that if he saw them get out, that he should also be getting out of his boat. He knew there was a reason to heed this advice because Tim Nelson, one of the paddlers he was with, had lost a brand new whitewater kayak somewhere on this river the previous year. He told them that he'd gone for a swim and that his boat wasn't broken and abandoned, it was just gone. Disappeared, no trace. Tim had been paddling for more years than Ted had. He was more experienced than Ted was. Ted was the river rookie.
Which is saying something.
He was wearing his wife's, or soon-to-be wife's, new dry suit. He'd bought it for her because she often got cold while paddling, but it just happened to fit him. That was possibly the first time the dry suit was used in kayaking in Minnesota. The guys he was with had never seen one before, and neither had his wife nor him had ever before worn it on a river. It had been designed for windsurfing, but had been hanging up in Midwest mountaineering and hadn't sold all season. He got it in a clearance sale, thinking that it might work better than a Farmer John wetsuit, a couple of wool sweaters, and a paddling jacket, which was the standard cold weather gear at the time. Now, if you are not a big paddler, you don't know how crazy this is, but it's essentially like a dry suit that goes up to about your upper chest, and then there are just 2 straps over your shoulders, and he's wearing wool sweaters underneath it, and then imagine like a rain jacket with a little turtleneck. That's crazy. I mean, nowadays it's just like neoprene all the way up to your chin. But as he put on the river, his wife's parting message to him was not, have a nice run, or be careful, or have fun, or even, I love you. Always practical and realistic, she said, don't get a hole in my dry suit.
The day started nicely. The sky was blue, the temperature was mild, and the water was swift and with most rocks covered. It seemed like a perfect spring run. The river was full from bank to bank with runoff from the remnants of the still melting snow. Ted said to Tim, what a glorious, amazing day. Tim's reply was like that first shock of ice water in the face when capsizing in spring runoff. Yeah, but the lack of shore eddies worries me. He hung towards the back of the group, paddling sweep. Not that the group really needed a sweep, but he did not know the river and knew there was some nasty stuff on it. He wanted as much time as he could to react.
They were bopping down the river merrily, having a fine old time in continuous class 2-3 rapids, which tells you something about the skill level of the group, if they're just bopping merrily in class 2-3 rapids. It was glorious. Then around a bend, Ted saw everybody eddied out, which is where you pull your boat over to the side of the river in some slow-moving water, in a big shore eddy, a backwater where they could stop and getting out of their boats on the river right. They signaled to him to join them. He was already angling his boat downstream ferry towards them, and there was plenty of time until he broached on a partly submerged rock in the brown water that he had not seen. He flipped upstream and felt a shock as if plunging your head into a bucket of ice water.
When he came up, there wasn't the usual chill as ice water seeped down through the layers of neoprene and wool. The rest of him was still warm and dry, no holes. The dry suit actually worked. But by the time he came up, he had washed by the eddy that everyone else was in. Ted was now alone on the poplar, being flushed downstream and knowing that everyone else had got out to look and scout or walk around a big drop. He also knew that there was something very nasty coming up, but had no idea when or even what that might look like.
A double-ledged Class 4 drop appeared in front of him that he ran blind, negotiating as he went. It was a stressful read and run, to say the least. All the while, he was desperately searching for an eddy, a backwater by the shore, or behind a rock where he could escape the downstream current. But the river was in near flood with the water flowing around the closest trees on the riverbanks. There were no big rocks in the river with friendly eddies behind them and precious few shore eddies. He was feeling very alone and vulnerable. Then in front of him, he saw the horizon line. Horizon lines are not good things to see when you're on a river. They mean that you're approaching a major drop or waterfall. The steep drop-off causes the horizon on the water. By this time, Ted was back paddling as fast as he could, but was still being swept downstream. He could only slow things down. He could not stop them.
To his left, he saw a small shore eddy that looked almost big enough for one boat, but just downstream of it was a sweeper, a big tree fallen across part of the river with branches straining the water washing through it. Sweepers, also called strainers, are the most dangerous things on the river because while water flows through them, boats and people tend not to. If he missed the shore eddy, he'd be into the sweeper. Then he'd likely be out of his boat, and if he didn't drown there, he'd wash through the sweeper and be swimming in the current right above a waterfall. He decided that his life expectancy would be somewhat longer if he was upright and in his boat, and so should not risk the eddy with the sweeper. He saw a V-line in front of him at the horizon. The river smiling at you means a tongue of water flowing downstream that usually signifies the best route. So still backpedaling, he lined up for the V.
As he got closer to the drop, he saw that it was a large conglomerate rock waterfall. It was a long slide down a steep-walled canyon. Jim Rad describes it as a series of steep slides dropping at least 30 feet and perhaps 150 feet. Logs are sometimes lodged on the sides. Rooster tails, pitted rocks, and other obstacles are everywhere. Ted's line was good. His run was clean. There was a big hydraulic hole at the bottom, a backwashing wave of water, and with what looked like a nasty logjam just downstream of it.
He slid down the waterfall, punched through the hydraulic, and hit a small, somewhat turbulent eddy just river left at the bottom. He leaned over and grabbed a rock on the shore to keep his boat from recirculating back up into that big hole at the bottom of the falls. Ted was alive and safe. He could feel his heart pounding, swearing that he could hear it over the roar of the falls. He was conscious of every breath. At that moment, the narrow ribbon of sky up at the top of the canyon looked bluer to him than he'd ever remembered the sky being, and the birds singing had never sounded quite so sweet. He breathed slowly and deeply and clung desperately to the rock.
After his heart settled down, he climbed out of his boat and pulled it out of the river. He scrambled up the steep bank and began walking back upriver. He had not gone far when he met Pete Carey. "Ted, you're alive," he said, relieved and surprised. He gave him a big hug. "Yes," Ted said. "You made it. We were afraid we were doing a body recovery." He was serious, and Ted knew it. "No, I made it," Ted reassured him. "Did you run that?" Pete asked somewhat incredulously, looking at the falls. "Yes," Ted replied, somewhat embarrassed. Immediately his voice changed. Pete was no longer relieved at seeing him. His paddling instincts had kicked in. "How did you do it? What route did you take? What did you line up on?" These guys that he was with were true hairboaters.
When John all caught up with them, he asked Ted rather matter-of-factly, "Well, what do you want to call it?" "What?" he asked, somewhat stunned. "You ran it. It's never been run before, and does not have a name. What do you want to call it?" "I don't know," he stammered, still just relieved that he was alive. "Well," he said, "what were you feeling when you first saw it?" He continued. "I bet you were pretty surprised." "That would be true, if maybe an understatement," Ted said. "Okay, that's what we'll call it then. Bilex Surprise." They all looked at the drop for a long time, discussing routes and dangers. The logjam was the biggest hazard. It was almost river-wide and extended downstream at least 20 yards beyond the next bend. Almost everything that went over the falls ended up in or under that logjam. Messing up in the waterfall meant being swept into this and probable death. Given the canyon, it was not really possible to set up any rescue. Both boat and body recovery would have been difficult to impossible. It was a dangerous drop. Jim later rated it a solid Class 5.
Although Jim is no longer with us, there is an annual kayak race held on the Presque Isle River in his memory. Ted is also still paddling whitewater, but limits himself to Class 3 or 4, casual. Bilex Surprise remains the only Class 5 drop that he's ever run. But if you ever want to get into whitewater, Ted is an amazing person to paddle with. Ted is one of our amazing community members here at Hoofer Outing, and a legend in the paddling community at Madison and beyond. He's also pretty modest in this story. Let's take a look at what this river really looks like. That monster is what Ted ran by accident. I don't know about you, but if I tried to paddle that, if I tried, scouted and everything, I'm pretty sure I would be dead. In fact, a different paddler refers to it as "you will die" falls. Here's what he has to say about Bilex Surprise. 100-foot long chute of white water surging over jagged rocks. Absolutely crazy. We're so grateful to have had the chance to read his story and share it with all of you, and a big thanks to Ted for sending it over and being an amazing teacher, as well as fellow paddler in the outing community. Our next paddling story is brought to you by Brian, who's another paddling legend in Hoofer Outing. He has a disclaimer on here that some of the aspects of his story may be slightly embellished, but he's pretty sure they're mostly accurate. This one we're going to be reading right in the style he sent us, so when he says we, it's really they, that sort of thing. But this one is titled Sacrifice at Horseshoe Falls.
All right. We headed to Pike River for a day of dodging rocks and surfing holes. Alec apparently learned how to roll a kayak since the previous trip, so it only seemed natural to push that to the limits and see just how much he had actually learned. When we arrived at Horseshoe Falls, we sent Alec into the recirculating hole below with a simple slap on the back and some "get on in there" encouragement. All seemed to be going well for Alec. He paddles his kayak right into the hole and then surfs it with confidence. He even flips a time or two, but rolls right up.
Now, if you don't know what surfing is, or it sounds weird that we're asking you if you know what surfing is, we're going to show a picture right here. So it actually is, you get yourself right at the point where a river flows onto a rock before it keeps going into its stream, and right in that little line, you can actually place your kayak and just sit there for a second, right in equilibrium. It's pretty tricky to do, and if you miss it, you just flip right over. So what they actually did not know at the time was that there was something under the falls that was hungry for kayakers. The falls flip Alec right from his boat. When the falls greedily feed on his boat, Alec pops up a few feet downstream, but still within reach of the mighty recirculating hole, which is a big danger for paddlers, because if you get stuck in this hole, that's bad news for your life expectancy. Alec, of course, listened to the morning's instructions regarding proper swimming in rapids, and promptly rolls to his back and throws his legs downstream. However, instead of safely traveling downstream, Alec, floating on his back, was slowly pulled upstream towards the hole until his head finally reached the water pouring over the falls. The downpouring water quickly devours his head, sending his feet skyward and around until they too were sent under in some sort of underwater gymnastics.
After completing an aquatic somersault, Alec pops up and quickly grabs the rock wall to his right. As he clings to the slippery surface, hoping to prevent a second inadvertent 360, he spots his boat flipping and spinning in the recirculating water just within his reach. Alec stretches out and grabs onto the boat. With only 2 fingers left on the rock wall, he is stretched and pulled as the mighty hull refuses to give up the boat and pulls on Alec like it wants seconds. Alec finally gives in to the demands of the river and sacrifices the boat to Horseshoe Falls.
Ah, that's where the name comes from. All right. Alec, if you don't know him or haven't met him, is the one you've been probably getting emails from. His name's Alec Lowry. He's going to be the president for this year, and he first started getting really involved with the club doing paddling stuff, and that's where he met Brian. He also does all sorts of stuff now, but if you want to get into paddling, Alec is definitely the one to talk to. Welcome to the third and final section of the Outing Podcast, Episode 1. This is called a Tent Talk, and this week we'll be interviewing Caroline Rose, who's the current water safety chair, and she'll be telling us a little bit about the boats, specifically canoes and kayaks, that Outing Club has to offer.
I could start with what I'm looking at right now is photos from some old trips, like on the Red River and stuff like that.
Sure.
I guess the stories, I feel like I should highlight what I like so much about going on whitewater trips with the Hoofer group. So looking back at pictures of the Red or the Wolf Rivers, I think what I remember very fondly and hope that we'll be able to do again soon is paddling the challenging rapids is kind of a bonding experience for the group because you're able to cheer on your friends as they try something that might be challenging, might be new for them, and give them encouragement, and then you're there for them to help them if they need it. And it's such a, I don't know, it's a great group activity. Whitewater is a team sport, even though it's also an individual challenge. So that's what I'm remembering, even though I'm looking at pictures of, one person paddling downstream through, say, Monastery on the Red River or Gilmore's on the Wolf. But what I'm remembering is all the people standing on the shore, setting safety, waiting at the bottom, taking those pictures and watching and shouting encouragement and vicariously moving through that rapid with their friends. So
Definitely.
That is such a special experience. So one of the really cool things about Hoofers is the huge variety of boats that you get to try. Combing back through the photos, I've found photos of myself in at least 9 different Hoofer whitewater boats on various trips. And on one of those trips, I took one of those boats, the Nitro, which is a solo canoe, out for its very first Hoofer trip when it was purchased. And on that trip, we had 7 different Hoofers each paddle the canoe down the first drop rapid on the Peshtigo. And we were carrying it back upstream again and again and again, 7 times. And I think that kind of encapsulates how this is a collectively owned resource, which is really great to have access to as a whitewater paddler. I was able to try all different styles of boats from different times in the history of boat design, and I was able to figure out what worked for me. And when I bought my own whitewater kayak, I was looking for the specific model that had paddled in Hoofers because I knew that it worked for me. So,
well, that's awesome. So, for people who don't know, what's the difference in a canoe between like a regular canoe and a single person? Like, what's the difference in what it looks like? How do you paddle it differently? You know, those sorts of things.
Okay, so solo versus a tandem open canoe. So an open canoe would be what most people in the U.S. think of as a typical canoe. It's open on the top, and if it's a tandem, that means it's set up for 2 people to paddle, one in the stern, one in the bow, so one in the very back of the boat and one in the front. Some tandems are set up so that the paddlers are really, really close together in the middle. That makes it easy to turn the boat on a dime. And then the further out to the ends you are, the slower it'll be able to turn, and that depends on the whole design as well. When you're set up for tandem, you're sitting in the middle at basically close to the center of rotation, or perhaps a little bit behind it in whitewater. And you have only one paddle blade when you're paddling a canoe. Usually you're either seated or kneeling, but seated up on a seat or kneeling, so you're elevated compared to sitting near the bottom or near the bottom of the kayak. So in a canoe with a single blade in a kneeling position, your paddle strokes are quite different from kayak, and tandem versus solo in a canoe are also pretty different. The concept is sort of the same in that you're moving either the front or the back end of the canoe around its center of rotation. But in a tandem, you only have control over the back half of the boat. And that's what you're primarily using to steer. The person in the front can direct the front half of the boat a bit, but that doesn't have quite as much of an effect over the overall boat. In whitewater, you certainly do a lot more steering from the front, but each end of the boat has their own respective responsibilities. Because to maneuver in whitewater, you need both people to steer in different ways to be able to make it down a more technical feature. In the solo canoe, you are controlling the front and the back of the boat. So you may actually modify your strokes so that you're doing a bit of correction in the front or doing a bit of correction in the back, as far as the direction of the boat. But you are able to reach in front and behind that center of rotation, at least in a whitewater solo.
Gotcha.
I don't know if that clears things up.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I was just wondering because I've only seen the typical tandem canoes, and I've never seen a single. Well, I mean, I've seen it in the boathouse, but a lot different seeing it on the rack and being in it going down a rapid. So
we have a lot of different kinds of boats. So solo kayak, tandem kayak, solo open canoe, tandem open canoe, solo decked canoe, and tandem decked canoe. And yes, Hoofers actually owns at least one of every one of those types of boats.
Wow. What is your personal favorite to paddle out of those?
I would say I'm evenly split between solo open canoe and solo kayak. However, I have recently bought a tandem kayak for myself, and it's pretty cool. I've only been out on very slow-moving, small amount of water in it, but it might become a favorite.
That sounds awesome. All right.
Okay.
Well, thanks you for taking the time.
Yep.
It was awesome to chat with you a little bit, catch up, hear about some canoes.
Don't get me started on canoes. Never shut up. All right.
And I'll talk to you soon.
Yep. See ya.
Bye.